June in the garden, and if your garden is growing, you've got some stuff to do. I know I do. So in this video, Jacques, myself, and a few other epic gardeners from around the country are gonna share what's going on in our garden, what we're doing for chores, and why. For me, one of the biggest things as the garden starts to grow in zone 10B in June, it's just chopping stuff back down to size. So I just finished up pruning my tomatoes, and I'll talk to you really quickly about two things I did. Over here, I have a double poly twine, and I'm going single leader. What that means is I've picked one single stem, the main stem that comes out, and we've come through and pruned off the sucker shoots, which are the things that are coming out between the main stem and a leaf. There'll be something in the middle there. Cut that off, and I have a nice straight line here on what's called my eating tomatoes. I'm gonna be eating these in like a sandwich or a salad. Over here, I've done something just a touch different. I'm still pruning these down to one single leader or one main stem, but I didn't do as crazy of a trellising structure. I just planted them all about 2 feet apart. These are my sauce tomatoes, my San Marzano tomatoes. So it's kind of up to you how you decide to prune, but for me, I like a clean single stem, but that's not the only thing I have to prune in the garden. The pruning continues with my squash patch, a crop that, number one, you probably get too much of, and you might not be so sad if you lose a squash by the end of the season, but number two, gets hit with a ton of diseases, powdery mildew being one of the most prolific. If you start seeing a little bit of this on your squash, you need to take it off immediately, and you need to get it as far away from your squash as humanly possible. This is powdery mildew, which is one of the things that can really decimate a squash plant. So overall, the patch looks great. What I'm gonna do now is I'm coming through and I'm removing leaves where I see some damage or I see some browning or some yellowing, because squash just really is just trying to die. It's just trying to die all the time from powdery mildew. So I'm gonna take these off and work my way through my squash patch, making sure I'm harvesting as I'm going. Oftentimes you'll find it on these lower leaves, especially as your squash patch starts to get kind of bushy, right? You know, they'll be shaded out, there'll be higher humidity, that's where the mildew wants to thrive. So I just wanna come through and clean it all up. So when you're dealing with disease that you know you just interacted with, like powdery mildew, might be a little paranoid, but to me, I like to just wash up, and I also will throw just a touch of disinfectant on here. In this case, it's just a little bit of soap, but you can do some hydrogen peroxide or another disinfectant spray, because I really don't want that to spread to anything else that's at least susceptible to powdery mildew before I keep pruning.
The garden is now entering June, and it is the perfect time to actually take a look around and assess a lot of your plants. Many of them are now mature and they are starting to produce their actual crop. For example, right before me here, I have a bed of peppers. And one thing that I neglected to do at the start of planting this pepper bed was actually trellising them. So let me show you how to trellis peppers, why it matters, and what happens if you don't do it. One of the beautiful things about growing peppers compared to other summer crops like tomatoes is that they are very simple to prune, stake, and support. They don't really grow very quickly and they don't need very much. All I really do is I take a simple stake like this bamboo here, and for a single pepper like this one right here, all you're really doing is trying to come between some of the branches. I like to get close to the main stem, and then I will push the stake in about an inch away from the plant. I don't want to go straight down right next to the stalk, because that is where the major root ball is, and I don't want to damage it. So I want to put that in at least about 6 inches, and then I'll go ahead, grab some twine. I just use cotton butcher's twine. This is something you get even at a grocery store. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. I like using this because it degrades instead of just being plastic that I then have to deal with. So what I like to do is I go underneath a current pepper. You don't want to go above because you don't want to put any pressure on that pepper. And all you're simply doing is tying a loop in this string. So there we have it, a simple piece of string looped around the pepper and the stake, and that is really all you need for pepper plants. They don't tend to, in my experience, break from heavy branches, but what they do is if they get too heavy, and especially if there's like a bunch of peppers on one side, the pepper plant will start to actually lean. If it gets too heavy, it'll lean so hard that the plant will hit the ground and it'll dig itself out. So while you don't need to do much, just literally a stake and a single piece of string will protect your plant from tipping over and unburying itself before you get to enjoy your harvest.
Fertilizing is an important part of garden maintenance, especially when you're growing everything in containers, because containers typically need to be watered much more often than if I was growing my plants in the ground. And by watering more often, nutrients are leaching out of this potting soil much faster than it would for plants in the ground. So I need to replenish them with more nutrients. At planting time, I will add a granular slow release fertilizer to my pots and my beds. Slow release fertilizers are great because they're going going to provide food in your containers for a longer period of time, but the plant doesn't take up the nutrients quite as quickly as if it was a water-soluble fertilizer. But at planting time, I'll typically use Biotone by Espoma. They also have Plant Tone. And then I will maybe add this again to my raised beds and pots 2 or 3 times throughout the season. But if I notice that my plants need nutrients right away, that's when I'll use a liquid fertilizer. Now, fertilizing was one of the most confusing parts of gardening to me when I started, and a brand that I came across that I really liked because it seemed to make it much more simplified was Fox Farm. So I actually use 2 different liquid fertilizers depending on the stage of growth of my plants. So I use the Grow Big fertilizer before my plants have flowered. So this one is higher in nitrogen, which is going to help the green leafy growth of your plants. Once they bloom, then I switch over to the Tiger Bloom, which is higher in phosphorus, and that's going to help support the growth of the blooms and the flowers on your plants. So for me, that was just really simple to understand, so that's why I've kind of stuck with that brand. But honestly, just a general all-purpose fertilizer in your garden can be perfect for your plant's needs. Most of my containers are, luckily, set up on irrigation, so that runs automatically every morning. But whenever I am fertilizing, I do that by hand. So I'll just fill up my watering can based on the instructions on the fertilizers, and then I'll go around and I will hand water all of my plants. So I try to do that once every 2 weeks, again, unless I see some sort of nutrient deficiency in a plant that I need to treat right away. But that has been a pretty good schedule for me. So make sure you are feeding your plants throughout the growing season, again, especially if you are growing in containers.
The summer rain and heat has already arrived, so I'm gonna get my set it and forget it cover crop of cowpeas in ASAP, and I think you should too. June is the perfect month for me to put in a cover crop. Now, I need something that can withstand supreme heat over the summer and that will help build my soil back a bit. So I've chosen cowpeas. Cowpeas are legumes, so they fix nitrogen, and they're incredibly lush down here in Florida in the summer, which means they're going to make a glorious green carpet that's going to smother out weed pressure, because over the summer with all the generous rain and sunshine, it's just an incredible environment for getting lots of weeds in your raised beds. So I'm gonna smother my weeds and build my soil with cowpeas.
So for me, summer is where my herbs really start to get a little crazy. This is a pineapple sage. I've gone through a couple pruning rounds on this. It's not looking amazing, so I want to reset it, and the way to do that is just to get a little bit harsh with it. So I'm going to come down, I'm going to cut off a lot of these flower tips that have already flowered, and I'm really looking to shape this plant so that it looks good and sets itself up for future growth. Now, you can let your herbs flower. This is summer savory that's flowering. This is some thyme, of course, that's flowering. I can use a lot of this still in the kitchen, so I don't need to remove that. Then I've got a basil that it's kind of up to me. Do I want to let it flower, or am I comfortable removing a lot of this and trying to kind of get it back to a more productive state? Personally, I'm fine, but what I'm not fine with is actually right over here is my sage. I've been using sage a lot lately in some summer preparations in the kitchen, and you can see I've got some flower stalks here. I'm actually just gonna come through and trim these all back down. Personally, I haven't found a big deal if sage starts to flower and then you decide to continue to eat it. It seems fine. But of course, if I really wanted to, I could just rip it and replant it with a sage that I actually propagate from a cutting from this very plant.
June is one of the busiest months of the garden by far. There's so many different things to do and keep on track of, but it's also a great time to start some seeds. In particular, right now, I'm going to be putting in a couple jack-o'-lantern seeds, because if you want to grow your very own pumpkin to carve for Halloween, June is really the time you want to do it. They take 3 to 4 months, really closer to 4 months to reach maturity. So now's the perfect time to get some seeds, sow them in the garden so you could grow your own jack-o'-lantern. But there's so much more to do in June. So let me show you some of the tasks that I pay attention to most crucially at this time of year. June is really the ideal time to be keeping an eye on your alliums, things like garlic or onions. If they are starting to dry down, even 10 to 20% of the leaves are turning brown, then you want to turn off your irrigation or at least stop watering. Once it reaches that stage, it's actually maturing, it's starting to dry down, and you don't want to get too wet because that's going to cause it to rot. Speaking of garlic, once you see at least 50% of the leaves are indeed dead, you want to go ahead and harvest that, and you'll see a nice big bulb, and you'll see that the wrappers have started to develop. If you wait too long to harvest, what will happen is you won't get any wrappers, and this garlic won't be able to store for a long time. So be sure to harvest on time, and be sure to cut off the water before they are fully dry and ready to be harvested.
This task is going to be for warm climates only. I'm sorry, colder climates, please forgive me, but as somebody that lives in a warmer climate, we are very blessed with a long growing season. And where I live in North Carolina, zone 8A, we usually don't get our first frost until November or December if we're lucky. So fortunately, this gives us plenty of time to succession sow and squeeze in another round of determinate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes have a much shorter lifespan than their indeterminate counterparts. They grow way more compact, much shorter than your indeterminates, and they have a determined amount of fruit that they're going to set over their lifetime. And usually it's kind of all at once over like a month or so, whereas the indeterminates, they're just continuously setting out fruit. So the determinates, they're gonna put out their flush of fruit and then they're done. That's it. So that's what makes determinates perfect for succession sowing. I like to start my second round in June right now. My first round is already in the ground. They're putting out their flush of fruit. It'll probably be done in about a month and a half or so. I'll harvest those, I'll pull them out, and then I'll plant my round 2. I'll be aiming for like the end of July, early August to plant, and then that'll set me up for a harvest in September, October. So I'm just gonna be starting a 6-cell seed tray of these Italian Roman tomatoes. These are one of my absolute favorite tomatoes ever. They are paste tomatoes, they're determinate, and most paste tomatoes are determinate because when you're making things like sauces and salsas, you often need a lot of tomatoes all at once, especially if you're preserving them. So for the preserver, determinate varieties are our friends. These are also very meaty tomatoes, meaning they don't have as much water content as other types. So that's also what makes them perfect for sauces and salsas. So I'm just gonna be starting these in a 6-cell and I'll be up potting them every few weeks until they're finally ready to go out into the garden and be my round 2.
Since our last frost date here in Chicago is mid-May, that means that basically all of my attention in May is just to getting the plants out into my container garden. But June is where my focus shifts to some maintenance tasks in order to hopefully keep all of these plants alive. One of my most important maintenance tasks that I will do throughout the rest of the season is checking my plants for pests. Now I have a small garden, it's about 18 by 19 square feet on this deck, and there are some pros and cons. So I don't have a lot of space for plants, which means a lot of the time I may be growing one of a certain type of plant, and if it's taken out by a pest, I don't have a backup. I would have to start it again from seed. So I want to be on top of any potential pest damage in my garden. A benefit of a small garden is that I can take 5 to 10 minutes walking around my garden and check every single plant for pests. Usually I will lift up the leaves, look for any signs of distress, and see if I find anything. Now, I've been gardening here on this deck for about 5 years, so I know which pests I'm going to expect to see in the garden. I know I'm going to see aphids, typically on my zinnias, but they can pop up on a lot of different plants. I will usually have budworms that find my petunias at some point, and I know I'm going to have some Japanese beetles on my dahlias. But I also always get a surprise pest every year. I don't use any pesticides in my garden to treat pests. Typically, I'm using one of two things, either my hand or my hose. I will use my hose to knock the aphids off of the leaves of my plants when I find them. I will just do that once a day until I no longer see the aphids on my plant. It's pretty easy, at least in my experience, for me to treat aphids in my garden. If I see any budworms, Japanese beetles, anything else crawling around and munching on my plants, I will use my hands. Now, I will typically use a gloved hand because I'm not at that gardening level yet of being able to grab the pest with my bare hands, but that's how I'll remove them from my garden because I don't want to unintentionally harm any other beneficial insects. And actually, often I will see ladybugs or wasps actually helping me with pest management in my garden. Ladybugs feed on aphids, and the wasps actually help me with the budworms.
For me, June, July, even August, it's the time of spending 5 to 10 minutes a day in your garden and doing like a walkthrough. Just walk through and do some stuff to make your garden better. So take this bed, for example. What do I have here? I've got some leeks, and what am I noticing? I'm actually noticing these leeks are trying to throw up a flower stalk. I'm gonna remove that because I do not want that for this season. I actually just want the leek down below. So onions are a biennial crop, meaning that year 1, they're gonna do their bulbing. Year 2, they're gonna throw up their flower stalks. Sometimes when you're growing them, they get confused. They think that year 2 is actually happening in year 1. So you wanna remove these. And this is one of those things that'd be very easy to miss unless you just spent a little bit of time in the garden every single day. So I'll remove these. Another thing I'm noticing in this bed is my lettuce. It's June. This lettuce, and here's a really good indicator. You see this guy? He's just getting a little weirdly shaped, a little kind of funky and tall. He is trying to bolt, or she, you know? We can't be assuming this lettuce's gender out here. But take a look. This is just about at the point that I would want to harvest and still eat it. If it got a little bit taller than this and flowered up, these leaves start to go bitter. So I'm going to take note of that, think of the time of season I'm in and say, this lettuce is not gonna wanna last in the garden too much longer. So I'm gonna take this guy right here, and I am going to take this bigger guy right here. And the way I'm gonna harvest it is I'm gonna do a whole head harvest. Now remember, you could, in spring, maybe in fall, you could come through and do what's called cut and come again and just cut these larger leaves and let it continue to grow. But keeping in mind the season, knowing that hotter days are to come and lettuce doesn't like a hot day, I'm gonna remove and actually just use the whole head.
Okay, so like many deep south gardeners, I have a severe root knot nematode infestation in one of my raised beds. So for the month of June, my chore is going to be soil solarization. Now, this is not a compulsory chore for every gardener in the month of June. This is actually just a last ditch effort for me to cleanse my soil of root knot nematode. If you have root knot nematode, verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, or a very severe weed seed bank built up in your soil, solarization can be a good choice. It's never my first choice. My first choice is to add really high quality compost and see if I can outcompete with beneficial bacteria and good quality soil. However, if I have a super infestation of root knot nema, like I have this year, I'm going to solarize. And the month of June is perfect to solarize in Florida. You're going to need 6 to 8 weeks where you're not gonna need to touch that garden bed. That sounds crazy if you're growing up north, but down here in the deep south, 6 to 8 weeks from the month of June, July, that's a really hot time of year. I don't wanna be out in the garden anyway. So, how do I prepare to solarize my soil? I'm gonna pull all my weeds, I'm going to clear out any root residue, and I'm just gonna get that soil nice and fluffy. Next, I'm going to deeply irrigate that garden. I'm talking, I might run the water all night. I want 8 to 12 inches of soaked soil, really wet. Then I'm going to cover my raised bed very tightly. Now, you don't just cover it with just any plastic. What you need is 2 mil thick, clear plastic that is ideally UV rated so that it will not break down and fall apart over the season. I'm going to very tightly set that plastic over my raised bed. And I'm actually going to hill some soil around the edges to make sure that I can't get any wind catching the piece of plastic to take it away or to tear it up. And I'm going to let it sit for 6 to 8 weeks minimum. In that time, it should get over 110 degrees in that soil, which will kill off root knot nematode, fusarium wilt, verticillium wilt, and most weed seeds, but definitely not all of them. It's not a magic cure-all, but it does do the trick. After the 6 to 8 week mark, I'm gonna pull off my plastic and I'm gonna start sowing for fall. Perfect timing.
I'm inside my trellis over here to show you guys something that is very crucial that you stay on top of, and that is actually to harvest all of your produce. If I were to leave this cucumber here to grow too big and actually start to become yellow, what that does is it steals a lot of nutrients from the plants. It tells the plant to focus on producing seed instead of more fruit, and then you will get a huge gap in your harvest window. So now's the time of year where you really want to go out there, harvest, and enjoy your harvest, because if you don't harvest often enough, you will actually get less produce overall. June really marks the entrance of summer, and as summer comes in, it starts to get warmer and the plants start to get more stressed. Also think about how small your plant was when you first put it out versus what it looks like now. It has way more leaf on it, which means it's going to be losing way more water to evaporation, and especially as temperatures increase, your soil is going to start drying out very quickly. So one thing I want to call out is to make sure that you're increasing your water to not just keep your plants alive, but ensure that they are thriving. You want to increase your water as the warmer months approach, and even in the heat of summer where you're actually the warmest, you might even have to water twice a day. It might feel wasteful, but keeping your plants alive to not get a harvest is really just wasting water when you can increase that a little bit more to allow them to thrive and still get a bountiful harvest like this.
Some people find this task kind of a hassle. Some people find it really therapeutic. Personally, I find it quite therapeutic, and that is removing the spent or fading blooms from a plant to try to encourage it to keep flowering. And this is called deadheading, and it is exactly how it sounds. Off with their heads. The entire purpose of life for most plants, especially our flowering plants, is to flower, get pollinated, start making seeds, and start spreading. And once a plant has been pollinated and it's started making those seeds, it really doesn't have a reason to flower anymore. So it'll slow down or it'll stop altogether. And one thing we can do to kind of trick our plants and encourage them to keep blooming is we can just chop off those flowers so that they don't get a chance to make those seeds and stop blooming. And our plants are probably like, hey, what are you doing? Rude, I'm just trying to fulfill my life's purpose here, but we want them to keep flowering. So they're gonna keep flowering and keep trying to create seeds until they are successful. You also want to keep in mind that not every flower is the same and not every flower blooms all season long. Some only bloom in spring, some only bloom in summer, some spring, summer, some summer, fall, some spring, summer, fall, winter. It just depends on the flower, and it really depends on where you live as well. So deadheading is really only going to be beneficial and promote blooming if it's the current season for that very specific flower. So it's always best to just do a little bit of research on the flowers that you're growing first. To deadhead your flowers, it's extremely simple. You're just simply removing those spent blooms, however you want to do so. If you want to be a little more meticulous with it and just kind of chop one flower by one flower, you can do that. And that's kind of how you would deadhead larger blooms like dahlias, zinnias, branching sunflowers, things like that. But for the perennials that kind of create more of like a bush or something like that, it's okay to be a little more haphazard with it. I just kind of go in like a little Meg scissor hands, just start chopping everywhere. I kind of pretend like I have like a hedge trimmer or something, and I'm just doing one fell swoop, just getting rid of all of the blooms at once. I've actually seen people use hedge trimmers for that, and that's actually a really good idea. I probably need to get me one of those. Deadheading can also be a great technique to keep things from flowering that you don't want to flower, things that can be really invasive, like anything in the mint family, for instance. I have an oregano and a lemon balm that are trying to start flowering on me, so I really need to take care of that, because if one of those were to flower and set seed, I would be finding it everywhere throughout my garden. So I definitely do not want that. And usually in those instances, especially with herbs, I'll usually just cut back about 2/3 of the entire plant, and that'll keep it from trying to flower for a long while, and it'll also encourage more leafy growth. This might be more of a pruning technique than deadheading, but I mean, pruning, deadheading, they kind of go hand in hand. For your edible and medicinal flowers like your calendula and your chamomile, okay, I'm gonna say it a normal way now with the correct pronunciation, because I don't know if that's too obnoxious to keep calling it that. People are flipping their lids in the comments, so here's a normal way. For your edible and medicinal flowers like your calendula and your chamomile, you just want to make sure that you're staying on top of harvesting those, because harvesting is deadheading, and that way you'll just continue to get more harvests and more blooms.
You just saw what deadheading was a little bit ago from Meg. I'm gonna do something I'm calling live heading. I just made it up. So take a look. I've got these zinnias, I've got these peppers. Pretty good combo, looks beautiful. But I like these colors so much, I actually want to bring them inside, but I want the plant to have a benefit from me doing so. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a healthy amount of this stem off. And if I want to, I can even clip this, right? Because this is going to go into a vase inside. So I can remove that and cut that at a 45. Now I've got a nice little cut flower. I could remove this too if I wanted to. But see where I cut it? I cut it at a point where it's going to now bush out. Because to me, this is just a little bit awkwardly too high, but I don't want to sacrifice the flower. So I'm going to use the flower as a cut flower, just like this. And that's also going to force that plant to bush, because now it's going to go in this direction and this direction. It's actually the same over here. But now I've got a kind of a nice little scape here, and I can manage this and grow it in the way that I want over time. So some chores for June. If you want to know what to plant in June, check this video out right here. You can of course shop our seeds at botanicalinterests.com. Subscribe, good luck in the garden, and keep on growing.